This afternoon, I was watching a film. It has two titles. The release title was Chappaquiddick, but the title in the UK is The Senator, presumably because most Britons won't have heard of Chappaquiddick unless they're kind of politically minded and or were around in the 1960s. I've also watched a documentary about the moon landing. This year, of course, marks 50 years since that. But while there was mostly coverage of the moon landing going on in July 1969, the secondary story to that was a potentially major scandal involving Senator Ted Kennedy. For those who don't know, basically what happened is the senator, who was then, I believe, in his late 30s, was involved in a road accident in Chappaquiddick, Massachusetts, I believe. And a young woman by the name of Mary Jo Kopechnik died. Well, he was drink driving, and there was a lot of circumstances around that that didn't exactly cast Kennedy in a very noble light. He failed to report the accident. There's some reports that she had still been alive in an air pocket for some time. The truth is, only Ted Kennedy 100% knows really what happened that night. But anyway, this was made into a drama film with the Australian actor Jason Clarke in the title role, playing Senator Kennedy. It's a strong film. It's quite atmospheric. It's a good film. I mean, it's got a lot of atmosphere to it, and it's about basically the events of that night, leading like from the crash, and then the long period where Kennedy ostensibly didn't report anything to the police, and it cost his presidential run. What I think was striking about the scandal was the perception of double standards. In the end, he only got 2 months, and that was suspended. And the charge being that he failed to report an accident. But in retrospect, it seems like a pretty lenient sort of approach. He did make a speech where he acknowledged his wrongdoing, but I think the way he handled it definitely damages credibility. Nevertheless, Senator Kennedy went on to a very long and distinguished career. I believe the fourth longest serving senator in US history. But during the height of that scandal, he himself said that I do wonder, is there a Kennedy curse? And it's that I want to speak about in this video. And I'll try to not make this too long. So there's kind of two schools of thought here. One is that there is indeed a curse with the Kennedy family, along with the Roosevelts, the Bushes, maybe the Clintons. They are a political dynasty. Camelot, they're glamorous, rich. They are probably the nearest equivalent to royal family in the United States. Although the Bushes have actually had more time in the White House, the Kennedys have a certain mythology that I think no other presidency has had. Even Reagan's shining city on a hill. I think no presidency is quite, or no political family is quite like the Kennedys for that. So there's two schools of thought. One is that there is indeed a curse. There is a series of bad luck connected with this family that is not normal. The other school of thought is that, well, it's a big family. Kennedy's a relatively common name. It's a big family, and in any large extended family, you're inevitably going to have some tragedies. I suppose it's like when you hear of accidents happening on the set of a film, like The Exorcist, for example, was plagued by it. The counter argument is, well, if a film, the work on a big film's going on for like a year, you have a lot of people involved, there's a lot of technology involved, there's a possibility accidents can happen. So the logic is, with a large extended family, the probability is someone is going to die prematurely. And you can find that in any large extended family. But the notion of a curse is sort of exacerbated because that family is very famous. I mean, the Kennedys, I mean, the interesting thing is JFK was in office for just under 3 years. Um, about 1,000 days, and that's a relatively short time when you consider all the two-term presidencies. And yet, there's probably been more collective films about the Kennedy family than any other president, except maybe Lincoln and I would say Richard Nixon. I can think of about four feature films about Richard Nixon, four or five. I can think off the top of my head of five or six at least about the Kennedys. Well, let's think about it. JFK, Bobby, which was a dramatization about the events in the Ambassador Hotel, Parkland, the Senator, which I've just mentioned, Jackie, that's five. Ruby was a dramatization about Jack Ruby. Um, that's at least six, 13 days. Around all these are around the Kennedy presidency, not to mention many, many references in other films. So I think that's a testament to just how much interest there still is in the Kennedys. And I think there always will be. Um, Forever. I think there's always going to be interest. So let's have a rundown of events in the Kennedy family history that are said to be attributing to this alleged curse. 1941, Ted Kennedy, well, the Kennedy brother's sister, Rosemary, was institutionalized for alleged mental retardation. Now, by today's standards, the way that Joe Kennedy and the family treated her was nothing short of repugnant. This was a young woman who was basically, by today's standards, it was thought that the family basically institutionalized her because they saw her as an embarrassment. And this is, the 1940s. We're not talking about the Victorian period. We're talking about the 1940s. Um, that's said to be the first thing. Joe Kennedy Jr., the oldest brother, was killed in World War II in a plane crash over the English Channel, 1944. And I only discovered this one today. Their sister, Kathleen Kennedy, died in a plane crash in France in 1948. 1961, a stroke left Joe Kennedy Sr. paralyzed, unable to speak, and he was an invalid for the rest of his life. And he died 4 months after the Chappaquiddick Scandal. 1963, nephew Patrick, son of President John and Jacqueline, dies shortly after premature birth. JFK assassinated, of course, that's the most famous of these tragedies, November 22nd, 1963. 1964, Ted Kennedy involved in a plane crash. What this doesn't say is that apparently two of those flying with him were killed. So the senator getting injured, I wouldn't say is a tragedy there. It's the fact that two other people on the plane actually died. And again, that's one I only found out today. 1968, the second most famous of these cases, is assassination of Robert Kennedy in the Ambassador Hotel during the Democratic primaries in 1968. 1969, the Chappaquiddick Scandal. The tragedy there, I would say, is for Mary Jo Kopechne. And one of the talking points about that scandal was that everyone was interested in saving Kennedy's political career more than the fact that a young woman had lost her life, which is kind of awful when you think about it. 1973, son Edward Jr. loses right leg to cancer. I'm not sure how old he was, but presumably if he was a young man, that's definitely tragic. Tragic in any circumstance, but particularly if he was a young man. 1984, Robert's son, that's RFK's son, David, dies of a heroin overdose at 28. 1991, sister Jean Smith's son, William, accused of rape, later acquitted. 1994, Jackie dies. That's Jackie Kennedy. She was in her 60s. I believe it was cancer. Um, 1995, Mother Rose dies at age 105. Well, that's hardly a curse. I mean, that's extreme longevity. So that's almost the reverse. 1997, Robert's son Michael killed in a skiing accident. 1999, John Kennedy Jr. and his wife Caroline killed in a plane crash. 2003, daughter Cara Allen treated for lung cancer. This is Ted Kennedy's daughter. 2005, first wife Joan treated with breast cancer. 2008, Ted diagnosed with malignant brain tumor. And 2009, Ted Kennedy dies. Now, Ted Kennedy was well into his 80s, I believe, 87 when he died. So there's nothing out of the ordinary about that. Now, of all those things I've named, I would say about two-thirds of them are a bit unusual, i.e., people dying before their time. There's others, like the death of the matriarch of the Kennedy clan dying at 105. If anything, that's not a tragedy, that's extreme longevity. Um, Ted Kennedy's death, well, an elderly man dying of cancer, nothing unusual about that. It's sad, but it's not unusual. I mean, when John McCain died, no one says, oh, it's a curse of the McCain family. Um, Definitely, it's easy to see where the notion of a curse comes from when you have two men in their 40s dying in very brutal circumstances, both assassinated publicly. That's definitely, would lend to conspiracy theories. Um, and JFK's son dying in a plane crash, he was only in his 40s as well. In fact, I think he was in his 30s. Um, the oldest brother dying in a plane crash in World War II, well, so did thousands of other young men. So I'm not sure if you could really say it was tragic, but was it unusual? No, especially not in the Air Force, where 1 in 3, the chances of being killed, certainly in the RAF, were 1 in 3 during World War II. So, is there a Kennedy curse? I think it's easy to see where people would suggest that there is. And Ted Kennedy himself, he was under enormous pressure when he made that statement. Um, but I tend to be a little skeptical. I would concede that the Kennedy family's had more than its share of tragedy. However, it is a big family, and for every one of those tragic deaths, premature deaths, there's probably been another Kennedy that's lived to an old age and died of natural causes. So, is there a curse? Guess it just comes down to how superstitious you are. Let me know your thoughts. Do you believe in the Kennedy curse, or do you think it's just all coincidence and just tragedy for the family? I'm more inclined to believe the latter, although I could definitely see where the notion of a Kennedy curse would come from. Let me know your thoughts.